to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Good afternoon. I am Professor Larry Jacobs. I direct the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. I am very pleased to welcome you to our program this afternoon, Donald Trump's Economic Policy for Growth, with Stephen Moore and Vin Weber. This is part of our Conservative Voices series, which invites prominent conservative thinkers and advocates and public officials, and serves the mission of our center to widen the diversity of perspectives and to encourage dialogue across the differences in America. This event is made possible by the Minnesota Business Partnership, and we particularly like to thank the CEO of the partnership, Kurt Zellers. I want to invite everybody to participate. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. That's your chance to send us questions, and we're going to get to as many as possible. So please do take advantage of that. You'll see next to the Q&A button, there's an opportunity to get a transcript and a closed caption feature. Please feel free to take advantage of that. And now I'd like to welcome my collaborator and partner, Vin Weber.
Thank you, Larry. It's great to be with everybody this afternoon. I've been involved with the Humphrey School in various capacities since 1994. I actually ran a program here with my friend Tim Penny for about 12 years. I taught a class one time. Lately, my involvement with Larry Jacobs through the Policy Fellows program, and more recently through this program, which we call Conservative Voices. So it's a delight to be at the Humphrey School. It's a particular delight to welcome my friend Steve Moore today, who I think of as one of the most eloquent and insightful economic analysts in the country. And I don't think that's an overstatement. Steve spent 10 years on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. He advised the first Trump administration and continues to advise the second Trump administration from the outside. He and three other prominent people have formed the Committee to Unleash Prosperity, which sort of seeks to get us back on a growth agenda. And he's the best spokesman for policies related to that. So Steve, welcome to Minneapolis.
Thank you, Vin. That's a very nice introduction. Great to see you again.
So Steve Moore, let's start out with, you've written about the Trumponomics. What is the Trump economic plan?
So let me start with this, that, I think two of our best presidents on the economy over the last, in my lifetime, have been Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. And so, and you were there in the Reagan years in Congress. Yeah. And so, Reagan and Trump have some similarities and some differences, but one of the things about Reagan was that he was an ideological conservative. Wouldn't you agree with that? Exactly. Yeah. He knew Bill Buckley and he knew Hayek and all of that. And he was well schooled in the kind of conservative philosophy. Trump is not an ideological conservative. He's just a businessman, right? I don't think he probably even knows who Hayek is. He probably does. But the point is that I think they both have done wonderful things on the economy, but they look at the world in a very different way. The fortunate thing for those of us who are conservatives, like the three of us, is that most of the conservative things that we espouse are also common sense. They just make sense. And that's why I think Trump views the world as what's good for business, what's good for investors, what's good for America. It's the whole put America first philosophy, which I happen to agree with. I think Reagan would have agreed with that philosophy as well. Now, do I agree with every policy that Trump espouses? No, he gets mad at me sometimes, but I would say 80% of the things that he did in his first term and he's trying to do in his second term are pro-growth, pro-free markets, and pro-America.
I think that's accurate. And I think the comparison to Reagan is insightful in a lot of different ways. I do think Ronald Reagan was an ideological conservative in the very best sense of the
Yeah.
where he understood what he believed and why he believed it. And he read constantly. And one thing that they do have in common a little bit is both of them transformed the Republican Party.
That's for sure.
But it's interesting, the actual realignment of the party into the party of the working class was much more durable, or has been more durable under Trump than it was under Reagan. We had the Reagan conservatives, but the entire party did not become the party of the working class, even in Reagan's years. So Trump in his own ways has had a more powerful impact. But let's get into this.
Can I just add
Yeah.
something? Because that's
Yes.
an important insight. And I agree with you. I mean, that, so Trump, I mean, Reagan certainly moved the party in the direction of working class
I
Americans.
agree.
Let's not forget, like the Teamsters
Yeah, right.
endorsed Ronald Reagan in 1980, you know, one of
Yep,
the major,
yep, I remember.
major unions. And so they both cared hugely about the middle class America, and
Yeah.
they both improved the condition of middle class Americans. What was different about Reagan's years in office versus Trump's is that the coalition was somewhat different, though. It is absolutely true that the wealthier the district, the more likely it was to vote for Republican in the 80s. Under Trump, it's been more of a, the middle class, working class districts across America went pretty heavily for Trump. What was interesting is Trump lost all the poorest districts, but he also lost all the wealthiest districts.
Yeah.
And so that's changed. You're so right to say the shape and the coalition of the Republican Party has changed.
Right, I think that's exactly right, and you're right about the income thing. The only group of people that the Democrats improved their vote with in this last election were
The
people
wealthy
earning,
suburbanites.
where wealthy suburbanites,
Yeah.
people earning more than $100,000 a year, which annoys all of my Democrat friends a lot when I tell them that, because they don't like to think of
That's
that.
right.
Here, but here, let's get into the substances. The economy's not doing very well right now. I mean, Reagan suffered through a couple of bad years, which were not his fault. They were necessary to correct the inflation
Yes, I agree.
of the 70s. But then he came back and the economy roared and he got reelected with 49 states. We're not doing very well right now. What are the prospects for us, as the president likes to say, getting through this over some bumps in the road and then on to a real prosperity time?
Yeah. So let me just make one point about the early Reagan years. You're right. Reagan was elected in November of 1980, and 81, 82, those first 18 months were brutal. Remember that? I mean, the 82 recession.
I had to run for my first reelection in the middle of that.
It was just a brutal period. And I think you're right that Reagan was trying to realign the party. And, we had to sweat the inflation out of the economy. We had 11% inflation, and Volcker had to, now some people may say he slammed the brakes too much. I think Jack Kemp used to say that. But the point is that it did take 18 months. And then, boy, once you put those policies in place, the lower taxes, the deregulation, the stable prices, we had the big, Robert Bartley of the Wall Street Journal called the 7-year boom.
Yes.
Now, I say that because one of the mistakes that Reagan made, and this is important.
I know what you're going to say.
I know. What am I going to say?
You're going to say that they delayed the implementation of tax cuts.
Absolutely.
I remember it well.
Yeah, and Laffer is big on that.
Yeah,
Because
I
Laffer
agree
was
with
the one who kind of helped, educate Reagan about the importance of lowering tax rates to grow the economy. So we delayed those tax cuts until they didn't even take full effect until the beginning of 1983.
Right.
Which is when the boom started. So I say that because one of the things I keep telling, the Trump people is get the tax cut done. What are you waiting for? It's been 3-4 months. You got a voter mandate to do it. You've got the Republican House and Senate, get it done. But you're right. The economy is really struggling right now. We've seen a big sell-off in the stock market. I believe that's because of the tariff wars. I think Trump's heart is in the right place here. He does want to get other countries to give America a fair deal. I don't know if he's going about this. It's almost like a wrecking ball type of approach.
So I want to just pick up on that because it strikes me one of the big differences between Reagan and Trump is that Reagan came into office. He was immediately on the road campaigning for his tax cuts. Where is Donald Trump? You don't see him. You see him,
He's campaigning for his tariffs.
Yeah, exactly. He's campaigning for the tariffs. And, there's a very direct impact for these tariffs. They're all over the place. They're up, they're down, they're paused. Some countries are dropped from it. And we've seen, this incredible drop in the stock market, NASDAQ, S&P 500. These are, really kind of shocking drops. And it's hitting consumers. Retirees are all of a sudden freaking out because what are they going to retire on, given the impact? So this is, I would say, quite a bit more destabilizing than 81 and 82.
Yes.
Then you get into really the core of the American economic position in the global economy in terms of trade, but also in terms of the safe havens for the US bond and the dollars. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because you've been an advocate for the stability of the dollar, and it looks as if, Donald Trump doesn't care about it.
Well, boy, that's a complicated question. I'll say this, that there are some parts of the trade agenda that Trump is endorsed that make sense. I mean, it is a factual truism that our tariffs are lower than virtually all the other countries that we trade with. I mean, that's just true. Yeah. And to quote Donald Trump, he'd say we're being ripped off. Now, I go back to Milton Friedman. I knew Milton. Did you ever meet?
I met him.
Yeah.
I couldn't say I knew him, but I met him. And it was a great
he
honor.
was, one of the greatest economists the last 100 years, and he was for unilateral free trade. If he were in this chair right now, he'd have said, we should be for free trade, regardless of what these other countries do, because they're only shooting themselves in the foot with high tariffs. And I still believe that's true. But it's also true that, Trump is a master negotiator. He really is. He really does understand the art of the deal. And his philosophy is, and it's still a little early to say whether, so far it hasn't gone so well. I agree with you on that. But at the end of the day, what Trump is saying is, we are the hub of the world economy, and every other country is a spoke. And what he's saying, and this is a truism, that every country has to trade with the United States, and especially China, by the way. If we wanted to throw China in a Great Depression, we could just stop trading with them. If they didn't have access to our consumer market, they'd go into Great Depression. Same thing to maybe a lesser extent with Japan, Mexico, Canada, and so on. And so he's basically using that power and leverage to get these countries to lower their tariffs. Now, whether he's going to be able to pull this off, it's too early to tell, but it certainly has caused a lot of turmoil. If I were to go see him tomorrow, I'd say, look, the enemy here is China. I mean, I believe China is a dangerous country. Aim your tariff guns at China and don't go after our allies. That's my own opinion.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think I agree with that. Let me ask you another question, though. First of all, I think when you talk about Milton Friedman, the only person I've heard in this discussion articulating the Friedman position was Senator Rand Paul. Rand Paul, who said basically there's no such thing as unfair trade. As long as you got a willing buyer and a willing seller.
There's a lot of truth.
And there's a lot to that. That would have been the Milton Friedman position. Trump says he wants to do this to bring manufacturing back to America. And that sounds pretty good to most everybody, but not everybody. There are some people who say that's a ridiculous goal. Why do we want to do that? We can prosper on services and things like that. What do you think about that argument?
Well, first of all, there's a mythology now that's going on in the Republican Party that's being articulated about a lot of Republicans who know better to say, the middle class has really been squeezed and they haven't made any progress. It's ridiculous.
Yeah,
I mean, it's totally ridiculous. If you look over the last 40 years, I just looked up these statistics. They're the official Census Bureau data on what has happened in median family income in the United States. Median means people in the exact middle of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. Do you know how much the median family income is up from 1981 to 2024?
No.
50%.
50%.
50%. Well, maybe just a little bit lower than 50%, close to 50%. That's not a shrinking middle class.
That's a pretty good record.
The only reason the middle class is shrinking is a lot of those people who are in the upper middle class have moved into the upper class, which is, they're climbing the ladder. So there is this idea that somehow, the middle class is being squeezed and evaporated. It just isn't factually true. Now, look, the Biden years were terrible for the middle class because inflation went up by 21%.
Right.
People's incomes only went up. So people were squeezed in that period. But over the long haul, since the Reagan era, we've seen, and by the way, under Clinton was a pretty conservative president when you look at it. Yeah. The incomes went up substantially. So that's point number one. Point number two, I'm going to just give you an example of what I have to say about this. I just became an investor, an early investor in a company that makes, that builds houses. They build houses with robots. It's the most amazing thing.
Wow.
I mean, it's incredible. The robotics is here. It's coming. It is going to completely transform just the way the internet sort of changed our lives. Robotics and AI are even going to be more dramatic in terms of their impact. How many trucks do you think will be on the road being driven by human beings 15 years from now? Not many, right?
Not many.
And so what worries me a little bit about this philosophy of let's bring factory jobs back is we're chasing the 20th century jobs, not the 21st century jobs. Now, when you said services, people use services like, oh, you're going to serve hamburgers?
Right,
And-
a waitress in a
services.
diner.
We dominate financial service. The technology industry is really kind of a service industry.
Yep.
Those are the industries of the future. And I think America is well positioned to dominate those. Do we really want to bring, textile firms back in the United States? I mean, I don't think we need
No,
those.
I don't think
So-
we do either.
Steve Moore, I'm just, listening to you, and you're doing a great job kind of running through a catalog of disastrous decisions by the Trump administration the first 3 or 4 months. We've got tariffs as a top priority. There's a profound misunderstanding of the nature of the future of the American economy. There's a devastating impact on markets, which, a lot of conservatives talk about markets as clear viewers of information, and we're getting some very strong market signals. And so, it would appear at this point that the Trump administration economic policy is in chaos. It's profoundly off track
Well,
at this point.
I mean, let me kind of challenge you a little bit on that. That's exactly what people said in Reagan's first year, right?
Right.
Reaganomics is a total failure. It's put it in the dustbin in history, and then we had the big
Trickle
boom.
down,
So I'm
trickle
going
down,
to
trickle
give
down.
Trump the benefit of the doubt here. Now, but you're right. I mean, the statistics are bad right now, no question. The dollar's down in value. The stock market's lost a huge amount of value. Interest rates are rising. I mean, these are very troubling statistics, no doubt about that. But ask me that question a year from now, and if we're still down, then I'll accept your premise that it's going the wrong way. Here's one of the problems that Trump has. I'll disagree with you a little bit on something you just said. You said that the Trump agenda is out of control. Actually, everything that Trump is doing, except for tariffs, I think is great. I mean, he wants to shut down the Department of Education, which is worthless. You got DOGE. You've got, DOGE exposing hundreds of billions of dollars of waste in our budget. You've got a pro-American energy policy. We're opening up our coal, our oil, our gas, all of that stuff. The deregulation agenda is absolutely, fantastic, that we believe in as free marketeers. So the problem is that Trump has kind of walked all over the pro-growth agenda because he's just completely stressing the tariffs, and that's something that kind of divides us rather than unifies us.
I think that's probably right. And I think I've heard you say this, that if they had done the tax stuff first,
Yes.
gotten the economy going as fast as it could, they'd be in a much better position to fight this tariff
The
war.
sequencing was
Yeah,
wrong here.
yeah.
But does Trump actually believe in the tax cuts? I think you made it very clear it's not a priority for him.
He does. He does. He understands that lower taxes are. I think he understands the supply side agenda. It goes back to what we were talking a little bit about before. When I just find the Reagan and Trump thing very interesting because when Laffer and I go meet with Trump, and we've met with him many, many times, oftentimes in the Oval Office, Trump is fascinated with Reagan. Fascinated.
Yeah, you can tell that.
Yeah. And he, because I think Reagan belongs on Mount Rushmore, one of our greatest presidents. Trump wants to be greater than Reagan.
yeah.
That's the way Trump is.
And
He always has to be the best. So he tries to figure out, like, what would Reagan do? Because, Reagan is so, by the way, have you noticed Reagan's stature has gone up and up and up and up and up even as time gone by. So he's fascinated with Reagan. He understands tax cuts were a big part of Reagan's success. So I think he does believe in
But
it.
apropos of your comments about Trump and Reagan, Trump is not critical of Reagan, but whenever he talks about the tax cuts, he makes the point.
Mine's even
Mine's bigger. Mine's bigger.
It is so true.
So let's talk a little bit about DOGE, because obviously DOGE.
Yes.
But they're a group of people who are, I think share some of your views, who say, okay, this has been great, but they haven't really gone after the big sources
Yeah.
of government spending that would need to be reduced. And they're, conservatives are thinking about Social Security, Medicare. Liberals talk about the Defense Department. And Donald Trump has said, not touching those. In fact, defense spending is going to go up if the current budget in Congress is passed. So, DOJA's gotten headlines. Some of the headlines are for myths and misstatements. Some of it is needless recklessness. But are they really the solution to the government spending problem that you think is so needs to be addressed with such dire urgency?
Yeah, I think so. I was a big fan of of Doge. I was one of the people who really recommended this to Trump several years ago. You should have a waste commission. Now, you were there, remember the Grace Commission.
Right.
And now the Grace Commission remember, they came up with hundreds of billions of dollars savings, and that was 40 years ago. So imagine what that would be today.
And most of them were implemented. Most of their recommendations.
Yeah, a lot of them were. And so that was a great effort. Now, my point would be, you're not going to be able to cut Social Security benefits or Medicare benefits to the extent that's even advisable unless you've convinced the American people you've eliminated the waste first.
I agree with that.
And so by showing people, and incidentally, the third biggest program in the budget, well, third or fourth or something like that, would be Medicaid. One of the things a lot of people don't even understand the difference between Medicare and Medicaid, but Medicaid,
Medicaid is for those
lower income.
Lower income people.
Well, it was supposed to be, but what we're finding out is that here's an example. This just irritates me so much. California this year is going to get $125 billion of Medicaid dollars. $125 billion. Now, what are they doing in California? They're signing up everybody they can for Medicaid. Yeah. Because when the program was started, when you were in Congress, it was like a 50-50 match, right? States had to pay 50% and the federal government paid 50. You know what it is now in a lot of these states? 90-10. But so it's a way, it's just a scam. But California is literally balancing their budget by putting more people on Medicaid. It's unbelievable.
Medicaid is also keeping alive a whole lot of hospitals. So you see Republican senators who are quite opposed to some of the harsh cuts in Medicaid. This may well end up blocking or at least hindering the passage of the tax cut. Well, and you see, for instance, in the senator from Kansas, he said, if we make these cuts in Medicaid, more of my rural hospitals will close. And that's true around the country.
What we need
so it's not just fraud. There is a fundamental role of Medicaid in keeping our healthcare system.
I'm not arguing. What I'm saying is, and I think Trump would say this, is we don't have to cut the vital healthcare services that Medicaid provides. But we have millions of people that are on Medicaid who are not eligible for the program, who are scamming the program, and nobody in Washington has ever done anything about it. So we can save $100 billion a year out of Medicaid and not touch the vital kind of services you're talking about. That's our goal, at least.
So there's a study done by the Dallas Federal Reserve looking at another aspect of government spending, which is government spending for research and development. And the Dallas Fed said this spending accounts for about a fifth of the GDP growth over the last 2 to 3 decades. And we've seen just, I would say a reckless effort to stop, cut, or end spending for science of all different sorts and National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health. Does that make sense to you? I mean, that's another source of economic growth is the innovation in the American economy and the support that the government has provided.
Well, by the way, this is not my area of expertise. It sounds like you know a lot more about this than I do. I would simply say that we're also uncovering ungodly, ridiculous type of research that's being done that have no, benefits whatsoever. And, some of the grants that go out are just ridiculous. And so what we'd like to do is see, a much better review of who's getting the money, what they're using it for. I believe, look, I don't really agree with, I'm not familiar with that study, but I think most of the most valuable research that is done in the United States is done with private dollars, not public dollars.
Including the Fed? Is that true for the Federal Reserve? You don't trust their research?
The
Dallas Fed, I think, is quite I
Well,
mean,
look, I know those guys and they're
Yeah.
really good people. So
Yeah,
I
okay,
can't,
good.
and I'm not
Okay.
familiar with that study, but I'm just saying that we need to cut spending. You know, it's way too high and we have to cut everything. I don't think we should be cutting Social Security or Medicare benefits. I don't. But A, politically, I think it's stupid. How many times have we
Yeah,
tripped
right.
up on that? And B, you know, people paid into the system and they deserve the benefits that they're getting. What I'm saying is we need auditors to really go over and with a fine-tooth comb how that money is actually being spent and whether it's being spent on the things that
Well, let
should
me
be.
just ask you one
Yeah.
other aspect of the kind of the Doge work and the work of kind of impounding funds,
Mhm.
which relates to the IRS.
Yep.
So it's a hot button issue, I know, for a lot of conservatives. But you know, there's 11,000 jobs were cut in the IRS, and the estimates that are coming out is something like 10% of revenue will not be coming in this year because of a drop of about $500 billion. Does that make sense to you?
Well, Biden basically increased the IRS by tens of thousands of people. What makes sense to me is there's no reason we have to have 80,000 IRS agents
Right.
in this country. It's just ridiculous. All we need is a flat tax. I mean, make it really simple, make
I
it
agree with that.
non-complicated. You know, if you do that, you can reduce the amount of fraud in the system. You know, if Laffer here, what he'd say is like, if you have a 50% tax rate, your incentive to cheat or evade that tax is 50%, right? Because you're going to
Right.
say, if you have a tax rate of 20%, then your incentive to evade or escape the tax is only 20%. So the solution is make the tax system really simple, lower the tax rates, and get rid of all the deductions. You were there in 86, right?
Yep,
When
when
we
we did the
passed that
Tax
great
Reform
bill.
Act. Yep.
We lowered the rates, got rid of the loopholes, and I think that was really economically efficient.
Okay, but that's not what's being done here. Doge and the administration is, again, you know, this kind of axe approach of just we're going to cut, and the questions are being raised, and they're not being raised, you know, by Democrats. They're really being raised by people who do, you know, I would say real research. It's just here's what's going to happen.
Well,
And-
I'm never going to defend the IRS because, you know, anybody who's been through IRS audits, it's outrageous. We had the IRS go after us for $60,000. They said we owed them. It went on for 4 years. This was back when I was, when I was nominated to be the Federal Reserve. New York Times put Steve Moore as a tax cheat in their headline.
Oh, geez.
And one of the things you discover, anybody who's been through this knows, it's like a proctology exam when you get audited by the IRS. And we spent so much money just defending ourselves. And at one point, my tax lawyer said, just pay the money because it's gonna be more expensive for you to challenge this than not. And that's what people. I think it's an abusive agency. I think we have to rein in its power. And one way is to reduce the number of IRS agents that are out there making life so complicated.
Van, I want to hop on to taxes. Did you want to?
No, I just want to say on Doge, it's because I agree with some of what you say, Larry, that there are valuable things that are probably being cut. But it seems to me, and this is just my speculative observation, is that what the Doge people are trying to do is scare the bejesus out of all the bureaucrats into stopping doing the dumb
That's a
stuff.
good point.
You know, because nothing else has worked. I mean, we've had the different commissions that have looked at, as you mentioned, the Grace Commission and the Gore Commission and things like that, and we still get all these ridiculous expenditures. And I think that what Doge and Trump are saying is, okay, we're just going to cut, and maybe you'll clean your act up, and we won't do all these.
Let me add something to what you're just saying. You were in Congress. How many years were you? 12 years. So you remember the Washington Monument ploy? Right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So every time,
It's also
Republicans say, oh, we're going to, force agencies to cut their budget by 4 or 5%. Yeah. The first thing they would do is say, oh, you're going to have to shut down the Washington Monument. And I think so you're kind of following for that trick too. The Republicans aren't saying cut rural health hospitals and Medicaid. They're just saying cut $100 billion out of the budget. And what I would say in response to this is, okay, why don't you make sure that illegal immigrants aren't getting, the Medicaid budget, that fraudsters aren't getting it, and not cut the stuff we want, cut the stuff that is wasteful and fraudulent.
I want to make one more comment about entitlement programs before we move to taxes, which you want to, and because we did, I mean, I basically agree with you, Steve, that we should not be proposing reductions in Social Security and Medicare, their earned benefits. But what I don't like is the fact that people have been scared, but frankly, by both parties. I mean, the Democrats are the worst, but Trump was on this too, into thinking that the only possible way of reducing spending long-term on Social Security, for instance, is to cut people's checks tomorrow morning. And there are ways of reforming the system over the long haul that really don't look. I mean, you can change the basis for the cost of living adjustment. In the 1980s, we raised the retirement age prospectively, not immediately. And there are a number of things you could do to save lots and lots of money, and nobody would ever open up their Social Security check and think, "My God, they cut my check." That would not happen.
Except that you're missing the main point, which is Social Security is an incredibly flawed system. I know a lot of people watching this broadcast are students. You know, I have two sons in their 20s. They're going to pay their whole life into the, Social Security system, and they're going to get a lousy return on it. So why not just turn it into a 401k plan where I'd make it optional to people? You're 22 years old. You put 10% of your money into just you don't manage the money. It's just an index fund of all stocks. And people, my kids and your kids and your kids are going to get 3 times more money out of it.
As you know, this was hotly debated after the 2004 election when
Bush
George W. Bush made it his top priority. And there were a number of challenges to this idea, including the cost for the transition, the fact that it would be less of an insurance for people who were lower income. So we don't have to review
under
that.
the system that I propose, you can guarantee every American they get at least the amount of money. It's only an upside. I'm talking about benefits that our kids would get that are 3 to 4 times higher. So the only thing you say, oh, you're going to cut their benefits in the future. You're going to make them work more years, and all of those things make a bad deal as Social Security even worse deal.
So Steve, I want to shift you over to a topic you love, which is cutting taxes.
I love that topic.
So
Good for you.
let's see if we could do something. We're sitting here at the University of Minnesota, and there are the dueling talking points. And I know you've got your winners. The Democrats have got their winners about, the rich soaking the poor. And so let's just skip that. Let's just go to Steve Moore, who's an economist. What is the substantive argument for cutting taxes?
It is that I'll make this really simple. If you tax something, you get less of it. And if you tax something less, you get more of it. I mean, it's that simple. So what we tax is people on their work, their saving, their investment, their entrepreneurship. And why? Why would we want to and by the way, the more you raise those tax rates, it's clear you're going to get less of this. Now, people could argue, well, gee, that supply side event doesn't work. It worked in the 80s for Ronald Reagan. We had an economic boom. It happened under Trump. People forget if it hadn't been for COVID, Trump would have won a 40-state reelection landslide. It worked. You go back to the 1960s, John F. Kennedy, a Democrat, cut tax rates by 30%. Every single time we have cut tax rates over the last 100 years, we've got more revenues into the government, not less, because we've reduced the disincentives to work and invest.
Just by coincidence, by the way, Steve, John F. Kennedy's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors was Walter Heller, a professor at this university. Yeah.
So, I think one of the kind of substantive arguments for tax cuts is that it aids the formation of capital.
Yes.
And that private equity is going to make investments. Yes, there are going to be some, schemes to get quick rich schemes, but the structure of private equity is that you need to get returns over the long term.
Sure.
So this is kind of the structure of what you're talking about. I mean,
basically, let me just summarize that. So when someone makes an investment, let's say in a new company, you're looking, should I invest in this? You're looking at what your after-tax rate of return is going to be, not your before-tax rate of return. And so if you have back in the 50s, late 50s, I think the rate was 90% at one point. So who would want to invest when the government's going to? Now, look, the lower you get the rates, the less benefit you get from lowering them, because, to go from 19 to 17% isn't as big as going from 90 to 87%. But I would make another point, because I have done a lot of work on this. We are in the great state of Minnesota. Minnesota has the 4th or 5th highest tax rate on income of any state. Yep. I think you're only behind New Jersey, California, New York, and maybe 1 or 2 others.
Illinois.
Yeah, well, Illinois is a really high tax state too. So there's no doubt about it that what is happening across the country, and we've done a lot of work on this, is that those high tax states are getting squeezed. And wealthy people are, the job creators in the states are moving out of these high tax states. California, which is the most beautiful place on the planet, right? A slice of heaven, in the last 5 years has lost 2 million people on net. Where are they going? They're going to Texas. They're going to Florida, to Tennessee. What do those states have in common? No income tax.
No income tax.
So this stuff really does matter.
Yeah. So let me ask you about, kind of the bright days of lower taxes, because obviously there's been a ton of research. You've done research. The Tax Policy Center has done research, and as well as congressional research services. And yes, the 2017 tax cut that was passed, this was Paul Ryan's tax cut
Right.
that Donald Trump put his name on. It did produce a jump in GDP in the immediate period afterwards, but it up to 2.9% growth of GDP. But then it came down, and it came down to about 2.4, and then COVID hit. So, the argument about kind of the golden days after tax cuts, it's contested.
Yeah.
There are people who argue it.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. But, I think the evidence is clear. There's a great book by my buddy Art Laffer called Taxes Have Consequences. If anyone wants to challenge what I'm saying, go to that book. I mean, he shows very clearly what happened. You go back to the 1920s, for goodness sakes, under Calvin Coolidge. I mean, we lowered tax rates and we had the roaring 20s. You know, Kennedy, we had the boom 60s, boom 80s. Now, look, it doesn't always work. It's like saying, well, somebody, cigarettes don't cause cancer, because I know somebody who smokes and they didn't get cancer. But, there's pretty good evidence. Look at what's happening, by the way. It's really cool what's happening in Argentina today.
Yeah.
It's one of the great stories. I mean, they've slashed their tax rates. They've slashed their bureaucracy. And you know what country in the last year has had the best stock market? Argentina, under Milei. So I think this stuff really works. And I think we got to get back to it.
Just not to complicate the discussion, but Argentina also doesn't have tariffs.
Ah, good point.
Or at least they're cutting the tariff.
Then
I don't like tariffs.
then there's the case that's made for and against that cutting taxes will pay for itself. And again, looking at 2017, there was a shortfall.
Yeah.
So again, this is just to make the point that these arguments are fought over.
So, there is something called the Laffer curve, and I think most of the people watching this broadcast know what that is, and it's one of the most important insights. I mean, Arthur Laffer really does deserve the Nobel Prize in economics. There's been very few people who've influenced economic policy around the world as Arthur have. It's a very simple insight that if you tax something at zero tax rate, you're going to get zero revenue. And if you tax something at 100%, you're going to get zero revenue, because nobody's going to work and invest. And so there's this curve like that. And you want to make sure that you're not on the wrong side of the Laffer curve. You want to be at not the revenue maximizing, but what tax rate maxes the amount of economic growth. So let's say that Trump's tax cuts that he's proposing now, let's say that they're not going to tax. I'm not making the case that they're going to pay for themselves.
No.
What I would say is, if we can get the economic growth rate up, that's by far the thing that drives the budget more than anything else. The economic growth rate. We've got to get the economic growth rate up, and we need to do that by a lot of things: increasing our productivity of our economy, reducing tax burdens, increasing legal immigration, so we have the workers to increase. And if you can get that economic growth rate up to like 3%, then, that scary curve, you're familiar, that shows our debt going up as a percent of GDP.
Yeah.
If you put 3% growth in there, not 1.7%, the curve goes like that. So we can grow our way out of this. In fact, I'd make the case you're not going to solve this debt problem unless you get more economic growth.
Let me
You
ask.
agree with that?
Absolutely. And it just makes sense. There's no reason why we can't have a certain amount of debt in this country. There's no reason why a business can't have a certain amount of debt. There's no reason why a household can't have a certain amount of debt, as long as they keep growing and producing income. When a business gets in trouble, it's when their income starts shrinking and their debt is getting bigger. And that's exactly what the point, that the comparison should be made to the federal government. And by the way, on the argument that the tax cuts will pay for themselves, Larry, that's a little bit of a red herring. I mean, we had that argument when I was in Congress and we passed the Reagan tax cuts. There may have been a couple of people that said they'll pay for themselves, but most people simply said the shortfall will not be as great as, for instance, the Congressional Budget Office estimates it to be, because we will have economic growth. And that still is the argument for tax. It's
So
not
let
that they will,
yeah.
quote, pay for themselves.
And I'll just add one quick thing to that, one thing that is absolutely untrue about the Trump tax cuts is this idea that it was a tax cut for millionaires and billionaires.
Yeah,
You hear that
right.
day after day. Well, actually, if you look at I just looked at the statistics for 2022 to 23, the most recent data. Actually, the share of taxes paid by the upper income people increased. It didn't decrease. And today, the top 1% pay a higher share of the income tax than any other time in the last 100 years.
We've got a bunch of questions here
Okay.
from our friends here in the audience. And I want to get to some of them.
Okay.
Tariffs are equivalent to taxes.
Tariffs are taxes.
Yeah. And so the question is, please comment on how higher taxation contributes to growth.
Yeah, well, great point. This is why, again, I believe that and I'm quoting, Steve Forbes and Art Laffer and others, the 4 pillars of prosperity are a strong and stable currency, right? Lower tax rates that don't distort investment. And then you've got to have, a lean government, and you have to, deregulate. So, and you need free trade. In fact, I'll tell you one quick story. I did know Milton Friedman. I got to know him at the end of his life. He was out at California at the, what do you call it?
Hoover Institute.
Hoover, yeah. He was at the Hoover Institute, and he and I used to once or twice a year have dinner with Rose Friedman. And I remember one of our last meetings, I wish I had tape recorded our dinners. And I said, what are the most important things to do to increase economic growth? Because, he's the master. He said 3 things. He said, number 1, school choice. He was a huge advocate of every child in America having an opportunity to go to the best school. The second was free trade. He was a huge advocate of free trade. And the third, by the way, was cut government spending as much as you can. And so I like those 3 principles.
We've got,
but yeah, tariffs are taxes, no question about it. But again, I want to stress to people, Trump's goal is to get other countries to cut their tariffs. Whether that's going to work or not, we'll see. But if he can pull it off, it could be quite a miracle.
one of the issues that's come up in Congress is the deduction for state and local taxes. And this has come up in the context of the tax cuts. So you're advocating kind of a pure view of taxes, but once it gets into the political process, it's a stew.
Yes.
So what's your view about the so-called SALT?
Well, I was one of the people who, when we put that first Trump tax bill together, I was one of the people who insisted that we get rid of the state and local tax deduction. By the way, there is no argument, no cogent argument that could be made about why somebody should be able to deduct their state and local taxes. I mean, why is it that if you go one place and you get the service paid for by a private company and another, the government provides it, you get to deduct one but not the other? It makes no sense. And all we're doing is encouraging states and localities.
And just to be clear, the people who are most effective in making the case for SALT are Republican members of Congress.
Well,
Right. What do you mean?
Well, New Jersey and New York.
Let me
New Jersey and-
clarify that a little bit. That is only true, Larry, because we're talking about getting enough votes to pass the tax cut.
Exactly.
And so that handful of Republicans from New York, New Jersey, and California become very, very important.
Right.
Most Republicans are not making that argument.
True.
98% of them are. But here's the point. I think what Vin Weber and I would agree on, and I think most free market conservatives would agree on it, the best tax system has almost no deductions. None, almost none. And, I would say you get a deduction for yourself and your kids, and then everybody pays. I'm a flat tax guy, 18% or whatever the rate is. I mean, can you imagine if the United States had a flat tax like, Steve Forbes talked about, 18% tax rate, no deductions except for yourself and your kids. You don't get to deduct your municipal bonds. You don't have to deduct your, investment in windmills and all this other crap that's in the tax system. But everybody pays 18%. Can you imagine how fast the American economy, we would just blow away the rest of the world, just the same way Florida is blowing away California. I mean, we just suck capital in the United States. So I don't want any deductions, not the SALT deduction, not this deduction. What else do we still have? The municipal bond deduction, and this, that, the other thing. I hate that stuff.
Another question from the audience. The so-called trickle-down economics, the tax cuts that land particularly impactful for those with higher income, increases disparity in wealth between the very rich and very poor. Why is this a good idea?
Well, again, the facts are the facts. Today, after the Reagan tax cuts and after the Trump tax cuts and reducing our tax rates from remember they were, when you came in, what, 70%, right?
Yeah,
The highest tax
70%.
rate, 70. That makes no sense. I mean, you don't want to tax people. Nobody would work at a 70% or 80% tax rate. We cut those rate all the way down at one point to 28. They're about 31% right now. That is over that time period when the tax rates have fallen, the share of taxes paid by the rich has increased. So I would ask your questioner, how can you say these were tax cuts for the rich when the rich pay more in taxes today than they ever have before?
Another question. You have advocated for a balanced budget amendment. Should Donald Trump adopt one?
We're so far away from a balanced budget
Yeah.
right now. I don't know what you think about it. I mean, look, I do believe in rules that would discipline our government because we can't always trust the politicians. But I guess I'd throw that one over to you. You were in Congress. What do you
Well,
think?
That was a hotly debated topic among our side of the aisle back in the 1980s. I thought that I was in favor of a balanced budget amendment because I'd always thought I was in favor of a balanced budget until Jack Kemp said, we'll never be able to cut taxes. And I thought, okay, let's think about this. And so I'm not for writing, I'm for getting as close to a balanced budget as we can. I'm not for writing it into the Constitution.
And does it concern you that there has been a pattern over the last couple of decades for the deficit increase, particularly under Republicans? It's increased under Democrats too, but there's been this increase among Democratic presidents.
Yeah, look, I'm not here to tell you that Republicans are economic saints. They are not.
Yeah.
They are not. Republicans love to play Santa Claus. You were there in Congress. They love, pork barrel spending. So I'm not advocating for one party or another. I'm just advocating for what's good policy for the country.
Thank you for saying that. Let's just shift gears here a little bit. When George H.W. Bush was at the Republican convention, he said, "Read my lips." And this is a famous moment when he made the case that he would not raise taxes. And then he became president and he raised taxes. And it gave rise to an incredible split within the Republican Party,
really?
probably contributed to Bill Clinton's election. So on the theme of splits within the Republican Party, there appears to be tension. We've already been talking about the fact that Donald Trump's priority is on tariffs. So far, 3-4 months in, not a whole lot of muscle going into the tax cuts. But the more significant tension here has to do with the vice president, who is in support of taxing millionaires. Could you talk a little bit about the tension, the fissures, the divisions among conservatives and within the Republican Party?
Well, that's a good point. I mean, the party, and I'd love to hear Vince's views on this. There's a new kind of strand of conservatism called national conservative. Have you followed this at all?
Sort of.
And it's kind of this new idea that is sort of challenged even in the Reagan doctrines of lower taxes. And it basically, they believe the middle class has been in decline, which I think is false. They believe that they want to be pro-union. By the way, I'm not against unions. I'm strongly against forcing people to join unions. I think, is Minnesota a forced union or right to work?
No, we're not right to work state.
Yeah, you're for forced union. So I think it just is a matter of basic rights of association that no one ever should be required to join, to get a job to join the union. But that's not to say there shouldn't. But there are a lot of even Republicans who say maybe we should just force people to join unions to raise wages. Some of them do want to raise tax rates. They don't believe in the whole supply side revolution. They need to be kind of go back and read their history books about that. So yes, there are fissures in the Republican Party. And I will say this, though. I do believe that raising tax rates is a cardinal sin. You don't do that. Raising tax rates is always and ever a bad thing to do. If you want to get more money out of the rich, get rid of the deductions. Here's an amazing thing.
Wait. Before we go into the amazing thing, let's just stay on the J.D. Vance theme.
Yeah.
Because J.D. Vance has talked about this during the campaign.
Yes.
He's
talked about what?
About the
Raising
million.
taxes on upper income.
Yeah, raising the taxes on the millionaires. It's come up in Congress. There's senators who are exploring it. It's kind of on the agenda. I wouldn't say it's near the top, but it's being talked about. If that were to be pressed forward in Congress, to become part of the conversation over tax cuts, what would be your position on that?
I burned my Republican National Committee card.
yeah.
No, I mean, the Republican Party, first and foremost, is never raise tax rates. We always want to bring rates down, not up. Now, the only point I was going to make is there are ways we can get more money. I would get rid of all the deductions. Today, did you know only 9% of Americans itemize their deductions?
I didn't know that.
Only 9%. Now, who do you think are the 9% who itemize
Upper
their
income.
rich people?
That's rich
So you want to tax the rich, just get rid of all the deductions. What do you think about that?
Okay. But I think the key point here is that there is this narrative. There's a narrative about, well, no one's speaking up about Donald Trump. And my take on it is, well, they may not be speaking loudly, partly because they're intimidated by Trump, but underneath the surface, there is a powerful set of potential divisions. And if J.D. Vance is going to be, a front runner for the 2028 campaign, it's going to be front page.
If JD, because I just had these discussions in the last couple of days, if JD Vance, because you're right, he is clearly the front runner for 2028, no doubt about that.
Right, I agree.
If he runs saying we should have raised tax on millionaires, he will not win the
Right.
Republican
Will
nomination.
not. It goes back to the debate about the read my lips, no new taxes, because I was in Congress when we did that. I remember vividly the Republican conference in the House of Representatives when we hashed that issue out. It was so bitter when we got done that I remember the future Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert, refused to shake my hand. That's how bad it was. And that's what'll happen if we run a president who's going to talk about raising taxes. It'll rip the party apart.
I would not vote for a Republican who was in favor of raising tax rates.
Yeah. Then why do you think J.D. Vance is staking out the position? Because he knows exactly what you're talking about. Smart guy. He knows
He's a smart guy.
it'll create a civil war within the party. So why is J.D. Vance, smart guy, clearly ambitious, talking about raising the rates on millionaires?
I don't know the answer to that question. I can guess. My speculation is that he's risen on the hillbilly elegy, working class thing, and he has unfortunately bought into the notion that part of that needs to be taxing rich people more. It doesn't need to be. Reagan, the Reagan Democrats didn't reject Reagan because he cut taxes on upper income people. They embraced him because he cut taxes on everybody, and among other things. And I think Vance, I don't know him. I know some of his top aides. They're very, very good people. But I don't know why.
Let me raise one other interesting historical point, because you're asking some good questions. You were there in '86,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And we passed what I think was one of the best bills in the last 50 years, and this was a bill that got rid of a lot of the tax deductions, but it lowered the rates, just as I've been talking about. Now, here's what's so interesting about that historical anecdote. That was 1986. You were there. Do you know what that bill passed? You know what the margin of victory was of that bill in 1986 in the Senate? 97-3.
Was it really?
97-3. So I would sort of toss this back at my Democratic friends. And back then, there were people like Bill Bradley, Dick Gephardt, others who believed in the idea of an efficient tax system. How many Democrats in Congress today do you think would ever vote for a 28% tax rate? Zero. So what happened to the Democratic Party? Where's the pro-growth, pro-prosperity wing? All they talk about, and this pains me because I'm not a rah-rah Republican, they talk about soak the rich, tax the rich, but where's the growth going to come from? What's the growth agenda?
Steve Moore, let me ask you about a theme that you've been mentioning, which is that we've seen Donald Trump first 3 or 4 months not going well. There's some serious concerns about the economy, about the coming possible recession, stock markets, and so forth, so forth. But you say, hold on, folks, it's the very beginning, and we may be looking at a very different situation in a year's time. So for Donald Trump to kind of pull off this reversal, he's going to need political capital. And one of the things that's been striking so early in his term is that he's losing a lot of credibility and trust from Americans on what had been kind of a rock solid political strength, which is the belief that he knew how to manage an economy, that there was support for him in performing and also cutting into inflation, which he ran on. Is he squandering that to the point where it's going to be harder in the coming months to provide the leadership that you're hoping for?
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that question. I will say this, I've been looking at some of the polling data, and so far, we're only, 3 months into his presidency. So far, the Trump voters are with it, even though you're right, it's been a brutal period, sort of like when Reagan, went through. Now, if a year from now, we're still in deep doo-doo economically, yes, that's going to peel off, and you're going to have big problems in midterm
Yeah,
elections, right?
That's another comparison to Reagan that is partially accurate, is that Trump is saying now, we're going to have to go through a little short-term pain for a long-term. The Reagan theme going into that 1982, stay the course. And now they're talking about very different things,
Right.
but it was the same message. If you just stick with us, it's going to get better. If
Do you-
it doesn't get better, then he's in trouble.
But the stick with it is the idea that the tariffs are going to create these deals, right? I mean,
That's the
the stick with it is.
got to pull that off.
Yeah, okay.
And I don't, I
But-
think
but
he will, but we'll see.
If I want to be an optimist about it
Yeah.
because I believe the same thing you do about tariffs. I don't like it, but if it can work, I'm all for it. It seems to me the question is, does he get one big deal from a country like Japan, and then it becomes a template that everybody else follows, in which case he will win? Or are we going to really have to go negotiate 70 separate deals? We're not going to do it. I mean,
It's
just
too
won't happen.
brutal. Yeah, it's just
So,
too
so we got a lot of questions. There's a lot of doubt and uncertainty at this moment,
Sure.
but still hope, at least from Steve Moore's perspective. I want to thank you so much for coming out to Minnesota, visiting with us.
We need more of this on I mean, I love your program. We need more of these programs throughout the country. They're really too rare. I know they're starting to develop, and I think you've really created a model here for how to have honest dialogue, good discussions with, tough questions, because I don't even I used to have conversations like this with my liberal friends all the time. Now they don't even want to talk to me anymore.
Yeah,
Have you noticed that?
I've
I mean, we're
noticed
not
exactly the same
talking
thing.
to both
Exactly the same
sides.
thing.
We're
Well,
just
I've got to
filtering.
thank you so much for saying that, Steve Moore. And I've got to tell you, Vin Weber and I are lock solid
Yeah.
on that point. You cannot have a vibrant university unless you've got a diversity of perspectives. It's important for students. It's important for those of us who do research so that we don't get complacent. And it's important for our communities to see that it's not just a hotbed for one set of
We need
perspectives.
to kind of have these programs, as I said, on college campuses all over the country, and reproduce it, because it's a great model for what do you call it? Dialogue across difference. I love that.
So let me just give a shout out to a couple of our programs that are coming up. If you like this one, May 2nd, we've got New York Times columnist Pamela Paul coming to join us. She's been a searing critic of the left and the right for its fear of free speech, and particularly speech on campuses. Come join us for that. On June 5th, former Biden National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan will be here to talk about the state of American security in the world and the challenges and accomplishments of the Biden years. This program has been made possible through a generous support of the Minnesota Business Partnership, and we want to acknowledge that. Finally, if you've enjoyed this program, it will be available on video or as a podcast, and you can get it from all your favorite podcasting services. If you'd like to continue if you'd like to see these programs continued, please feel free to donate. We welcome that.
We could say that more than once.
Yeah. Well,
It's tax deductible, right?
it is tax deductible. and-
Take advantage of that while it still exists.
Yeah. Vin, you want the last word?
No, I just want to, I think that this is a great discussion, and I appreciate the questions. One of the things we always say to, Larry and I say to people, is we're not so much trying to change your mind as to get you to understand what the people who you disagree with really think. Not the caricature, not the bumper
Right.
sticker, but what they really think. And to those who are not persuaded by some of the arguments they've heard today, I hope you understand the caricature is not true. There are people on both sides of these issues that have genuine reasons for believing what they believe. And Steve, thank you so much for coming to Minnesota.
So much for having me.
Thanks for coming, Steve. And take care, folks. Thanks for joining us.